Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. On behalf of Sparc Technologies, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. Today's session is in listen mode only. If you'd like to ask a question at any point, please type it into the chat box and we'll address it during the Q&A at the end. Presenting today will be Managing Director Nick O'Loughlin, who will provide an update on Sparc's graphene additive business, Ecosparc. I'll now hand over to Nick to run through the presentation.
Thanks, Simon, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me here today. As Simon mentioned, this is a webinar focused on our Graphene Additives division, and I look forward to taking you through the materials that were released to the ASX this morning. So for those that are less familiar with Sparc, we have two technology divisions. We are developing green hydrogen technology in partnership with Fortescue and the University of Adelaide. That is going really well, and we recently got a significant grant there and are developing a pilot plant up at Roseworthy, and we'll have more to say about that shortly. The division I'm talking about today is on the right, our Graphene Additives division. We've been developing technology in that space for almost 6 years as a listed company, and we are advancing towards commercialization with our flagship product, which is called Eospark, which is a performance additive for protective coatings. From a corporate perspective, the overview is here on screen. I think two key things to note. We reported cash of almost $2.5 million as at the end of September. This week we announced a $980,000 R&D rebate, so we're relatively well funded for our current activities. And secondly, one of the things I'm most focused on is building credible partners across both of our technology divisions, and I think it's testament on the slide here with some of the names, a selection of names of really significant businesses that are working with Sparc. And I think that's a really important validation for what we're doing and the business cases that we are developing across both of our technology areas. This slide is interesting for a couple of reasons. I think firstly, we've seen material tailwinds behind industrial technologies on the ASX since probably late in Q2 of this year, and certainly running through Q3. It's tailed off a little bit in Q4, but certainly there's been some really strong winners on the ASX, and there's certainly money around for industrial technologies, which is pleasing to see. That has actually extended into graphene players, mainly overseas, particularly on the TSX and AIM, where there's been some, again, really significant winners in that space. And secondly, looking at the market caps on the bottom of the screen there, with many of these companies pre-revenue, you can see there are some really significant market caps, over and above $1 billion Australian. So Sparc is trading right at the bottom of that sort of list with a market cap of 18 million. And to me, that suggests that there's a lot of potential as we deliver on our technologies. So to talk about graphene briefly, this is a new slide, but I think it's an important one to set the scene and establish how we are different from some of our peers in the graphene space. Graphene, at the end of the day, is a material. It's pure carbon material in a hexagonal 2D lattice structure. It's been around for about 20 years, but it's far from a commodity. There are hundreds of grades of graphene and many different production methods. And that drives different characteristics of the material. Sparc does not produce graphene, unlike many of our peers. So effectively, we're agnostic to the source, and we tailor our graphene additives for the specific use case. And that's a really important distinction. And I think it's been a really smart approach to this space, because it allows us to pick the best material for the application, and also materials which are going to make sense from a cost perspective as well. So we're not beholden to any particular source. And what we've found is that only a select few graphenes will work in a particular application. Certainly in the anti-corrosion space, we've found that. And as we're developing some other earlier stage technologies in packaging and also in anti-fouling and aquaculture, we're finding the same thing. So to me, that's a real advantage. And we've built our team and expertise around the end use of the graphene additives rather than on the production of the graphene itself, which is a key differentiator. So that's allowed us to effectively develop a graphene technology platform. Our most advanced is Eospark, which is an additive for protective coatings, but we're also developing earlier stage technology importantly with credible partners in sustainable packaging, aquaculture, and we have an emerging project in artificial intelligence where we're working with the Australian Institute of Machine Learning on a project regarding the assessment, much quicker and more accurate assessment of corrosion. So we'll have more to say about that over coming weeks and months, hopefully. But our approach in all of these areas is to partner as early as possible with the end users and then effectively co-develop the technology with Sparc providing the graphene expertise and the graphene formulation into additives that can then be used by the end user. So to switch on to Eospark now, which is our most advanced graphene additive. And what Eospark is an additive for widely used protective and marine coatings. And these are coatings that are used on steel infrastructure to protect against corrosion. It is a massive industry. All steel infrastructure in corrosive environments uses these coatings. Think of the Sydney Harbour Bridge and how you always see scaffolding there. That's to recoat the asset and protect it against corrosion. So the market for these coatings is in heavy steel infrastructure, jetties, ports, bridges, mining, oil and gas infrastructure, boats, etc. So Eospark is an additive that we've developed, and it's a drop-in additive for existingly used protective coatings. We've done a number of things over the past few years to de-risk the additive and to test it extensively. And I'm pleased to say now we're really approaching commercialization, a tipping point there where we get into the market and really solidify our position as the leading graphene-based additive in this particular segment. And it's an interesting segment because of the size of the end use in terms of protective and marine coatings. There's a number of different sources for market forecasts, but they all agree that it's an industry which is tens of billions of dollars today and growing at greater than GDP because the stock of steel infrastructure and aging steel infrastructure in particular continues to grow. There is a slight distinction between protective coatings and marine coatings, and our additive can play in both. Protective coatings are used on general steel infrastructure, which includes those jetties and ports, etc. that I mentioned before. Marine coatings is specific to boats and shipping. Now, there's a distinction within marine coatings. The bottom half or the hull coatings are typically anti-fouling, and the top half are where you're looking to protect against corrosion. The top half of the boats is where our Eospark additive currently plays, and we do have some emerging tech in the anti-fouling space as well. The other point to note is that it's a consolidated industry, as you can see with these charts. The top 5 players across both protective and marine coatings control well over 50% of the market. So in terms of our competitive positioning and advantage, I'm confident in saying that Eospark is the leading graphene-based additive product for protective and marine coatings. And I'm confident in saying that because we've had that feedback from several of our customers. And it's supported by the fact that we have a very extensive data package, as I'll explain over the side in the next slide, which includes 6 years of work developing the additive and testing it in terms of its anti-corrosion performance in a variety of formulations. We have a very experienced team, which was built on the back of people from the coatings industry, and then built out to include a lab team, which has been working with graphene over that period of time. We also have proprietary graphene sourcing and dispersion. So we're very protective of the sources of graphene that we use for the product, and also the way that we disperse it in a media where it is stable over a long period of time. That's a key thing for graphene, is keeping the graphene particles themselves dispersed within a liquid media. Oftentimes, the graphene particles want to come back into chunks, and if that happens, it will ruin the performance of the coating. And we also demonstrated a method of action which is leading within the industry. I've discussed this in presentations prior, but I believe we're the first ones to demonstrate this method, where the graphene is acting as a shock absorber in the protected coatings and basically reducing cracking and the propagation of cracking, which leads to corrosion. I think it's worth touching on our data package because it's really significant, and I often get asked how you measure corrosion, which in the field is a slow multi-year process. So the way it's typically done, and the way that we do it, includes, among other test methods, a method called cyclic corrosion testing using ISO 12944. Now, this is up to a 6-month test, which is the 4,200 hours there in the chart, and it simulates accelerated corrosion through a cycle of temperature changes, UV and salt spray. We've done 9 rounds of this ISO 12944 testing since earlier this decade. This is a significant body of work, and we've seen repeatedly that the inclusion of our Eospark additives within both formulations that we've developed, but importantly, commercially available coatings in this space, significantly improves the corrosion performance of those coatings. This is quite a harsh test, and it effectively measures the extent of corrosion from a defect that you put in the steel panel. And you measure that corrosion creep, and relative to the standard, you can determine the improvement or lack thereof through using, in our case, our Eospark additive. So this data set is unmatched across the industry. And that's now extended into the field, where we have been or had field trials with Eospark enhanced coatings underway for over 12 months. This week, we announced a collaborative project with Dulux Australia at the Cape Jaffa Lighthouse in Kingston Southeast, which is a National Trust asset. And that project and trial involves incorporating our Eospark additive into Dulux's Durabuild STE product and applying that onto the lighthouse as part of a big maintenance effort that they're making there. And we're putting that up against the unmodified Durabuild STE product side by side. So it's a really significant project that we're undertaking with Dulux, and we're working in these field trials, obviously across multiple assets, but importantly with multiple coatings collaborators now, which is really quite significant. And this is de-risking the use of the Eospark additive and ultimately unlocking the path to commercialization within well-known and widely used protective coatings. And why does this all matter, and why do we have the uptake from not only the coatings collaborators, but importantly, the end users of these coatings? And we've got some quite significant ones when you consider the names on the previous slide, including National Trust, BHP, Santos, Government of South Australia. So what's the value add of our product? Well, it ultimately comes down to increasing the durability and performance of the protected coatings used on the asset, which means that you extend the time between maintenance events, effectively recoating events. So ultimately, the paint lasts longer, you maintain less, you save a lot of costs and also some carbon emissions. But the important piece of the puzzle there is that the return on investment is really significant. And just to explain that, By paying a little bit more for the coating, and I'm talking, let's say 10% as a round number to use the Eospark enhanced version of the coating, even by extending out the maintenance, and to take an example of extending it from 6 years to 8 years, the return on investment is massive because the cost of that maintenance is not in the cost of the coating. That's single-digit percentage on the cost of that overall event. The cost really goes to getting the people there, the scaffolding, all of the health and safety, the encapsulation, etc. So that really drives that return on investment, and that's why we've had really strong interest and uptake from end users, and that's really supporting our pathway to market. And just to touch on that pathway to market and where we sit, this is our current pipeline pictorially, and I'm pleased to say that this pipeline has grown significantly over the past 12 to 18 months and really demonstrates the progress that we're making, both with the increase in the number of testing programs and field trials that we're undertaking, but now moving into commercial negotiations and commercial discussions with coatings manufacturers. So that's really providing us with a lot of confidence, but also increasing confidence that within a not too distant period of time, we will have Eospark enhanced products in the protective coatings market. And the positive from that consolidation of the protective coatings markets that I mentioned before is that once you're in, it's a really scalable model. And the journey to get to this point has obviously been really substantial. I'm really excited by what the next phase holds. So success for Sparc in terms of commercialization and what that looks like. Ultimately, it means having Eospark enhanced protective coatings available on the market. So the model, once we're able to do that and get across that hurdle, is a really good one. It's a really positive story to tell. Not only the fact that we manufacture and are able to manufacture commercial volumes of our additive in Adelaide today, but also that we're able to set up that manufacturing really cost effectively, and it sits within an existing industrial facility. So we effectively rent a small space there. That production facility cost us about $100,000 to set up, and it can produce enough additive to dose about 4.5 million litres of protective coatings. And the reason for that is because we're only adding our additive at a level of 2% in the overall formulation. So a little bit of additive goes a long way in terms of the end product. And just to put those numbers in context, and particularly that 4.5 million litres from the current facility, this is the global market for protective and marine coatings, split by region. So within Australia, at 2030, the estimate is that the market size is about 85 million litres. So our facility would represent a bit under 5%, or about 5% of the Australian market. But as you'd expect, the global market is significantly bigger, in the range of 2 billion litres. And within that, our assessment is that Eospark is suitable from a cost imposition perspective, and also from an end product perspective, is suited to about 25% of the wider market. So 25%, or a quarter of 2 billion litres, gets us to a figure of about 500 million litres, which we think is addressable. That represents over 100 times our current manufacturing capacity. And that just shows, in a simple way, the scalability of the additive production, and also, again, considering the consolidation of the market. Once you're able to get in with even one of those players, the ability to scale is really quite significant, and it's worth the effort. And the effort has been significant, no doubt. We've been on really quite a journey since the business was listed at the end of 2020. And we're now to the point of having Eospark enhanced coatings on assets in the field for over 12 months. That's certainly seen as a key milestone for de-risking the asset And that's really been the springboard to launch the commercial discussions that are now underway. Ultimately, our goal is to expand Ecosparc across as much of the protected coatings market as we can. And we'll look at various options to do that, including manufacturing the product ourselves, but also to expand overseas. We would certainly look at tolling and potentially licensing the production of the additive. So I'll quickly wrap up in terms of the overall opportunity in terms of where we sit with Sparc. We have had a really good year in 2025, particularly over the first half of the year. We had a lot of activity within Sparc Hydrogen, which culminated in a significant grant supporting the pilot plant. We are approaching commissioning and production from the pilot plant very soon. So there's some exciting developments occurring there during the back end of the year. And as I've just discussed, for Eospark, I think we're approaching an inflection point of getting into the market and then hopefully being able to scale that quite rapidly. We're working with large industry players. That's always been our focus. And it takes a bit more time when you do that, but the rewards are there if you can do it successfully. And I think the public collaboration with Dulux is a testament to that, albeit in a trial form. But these companies, don't do that type of thing without being really credible ourselves. So I'm really pleased that we're able to get that across the line. And I think, as I've discussed, the next step is really getting Eospark into the market through commercialization agreements and sales, which are not too far away. So I think we've got a really strong story to tell across both of our divisions. We're partnering with some leading players, both in the hydrogen space and with our graphene additives. We have strong revenue potential in the near term with a much broader global market to address, with some blue sky projects using our expertise, our deep expertise in developing graphene additives. And if you look at it across the peers in the market, I think there's a really good story to tell from the comparables that there's significant upside in where Sparc sits at the moment and clear re-rating potential. So I'll pause there or stop there and invite questions from Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Thanks for the update. Just a reminder that we'll open up for questions now, and if you have them, please type them into the chat box, and we'll work through as many as possible. I've actually got one myself, Nick, before they come in. Sparc's presenting this week at a Middle Eastern Corrosion Conference with Denis Wright and alongside a co-author from Aramco. Can you talk about the significance of the conference and what the presentation means in terms of industry engagement validation for Ecosparc?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. And this is something that's been referenced on our social media and our quarterly report, but a number of listeners may not be aware that we have a paper jointly authored with Aramco, the largest oil and gas company in the world, and a very significant user of protected coatings, as you'd expect. At the moment in Saudi Arabia. In fact, the presentation is today at Saudi Arabian time. So again, partnering with really significant, credible players in the space, which enable broad market access, is and has been and continues to be a key focus of mine. So Aramco putting their name against Sparc's at this conference, which is a significant one, particularly in that region, is a really, really positive step forward. And there's ongoing projects there sitting behind that as well. So yeah, really, really positive is the upshot of that. Great to be partnering and working with a name like Aramco, who's an end user of these coatings. And it's an example of some of the work that goes on behind the scenes, in addition to what we've put out to market with the trials.
All right, thank you. Just one come up through about the graphene market. Well, what do you think's actually changed more recently in terms of investor sentiment towards graphene and graphene technologies?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one. We've certainly seen an uptick with some of our peers overseas, listed peers, and there has been a shift even since I've been in this role over 2 years towards graphene and other kind of critical kind of technologies which graphene sort of falls into. I think the uptick is being driven by some credible players now in the market. I think there are a number of effectively salesmen going back 5 to 10 years trying to flog graphene wherever they could. But the ones that are still around are those that, like Sparc, are really developing a credible use case, business case around the use of graphene. And that's slowly seeing adoption in plastics. We're obviously leaders in the coating space. There's some electronic and semiconductor type applications which seem to be gaining ground as well. And that's all sort of snowballing and causing more people to talk about it. And I think that's driving some of the momentum that we're seeing from the market.
All right, thanks, Nick. Another one here. I guess I'll just summarize it. They're talking about the share price of late, which obviously could be better, I suppose. But what do you think the trigger to change? What's a trigger maybe in the future? Do you think that's going to change it? Is it the landing of more commercial contracts?
Yeah, look, I think my view on this, and I've followed markets, well before my role at Sparc, is that the share price has sort of been flat really over the past 6 months since we raised money in April, March of this year. And it's kind of been supported particularly by some existing shareholders and supported on the back of a lot of the work we're doing in the hydrogen space with Fortescue and the uni within the Sparc Hydrogen Partnership. I think the market's keen to understand how that pilot is going. As I mentioned, we're looking to produce hydrogen very soon from the plants, and we'll be able to say more about that at that time. It's taken a little bit longer to tick and tie all of the final bits and pieces that have gone with the plant, but there's no red flags or issues there. It's just been a project management exercise. I think what we'll see a real re-rating, in my view, is that tipping point for commercialization of Eospark. And I think establishing not only revenue for revenue's sake is worth nothing to me. I'm interested in sustainable revenue and revenue that can be built upon hopefully quite rapidly. And that's why we're working with the partners that we are. If we wanted to sell a little bit of our additive to a variety of different players and book thousands of dollars of revenue, probably could have done that already. But my interest is in securing proper commercialization of our additive with credible partners that will take it forward in their product range, and those product ranges can lead to significant benefits for Sparc. So I think once we're able to deliver on that, I would definitely expect a re-rate.
All right, thanks, Nick. Next one is about, oh, sorry, I just lost it. About patents. Do you actually have patents granted for Eospark? And if so, what are the locations? And if not, I guess, how are you protecting your IP?
That's a good question. We don't have patents around Eospark. We would if there were areas available within that space, but what we found is that graphene has been widely researched, I would say, over a couple of decades. And that led to a flurry of patenting activity going back 5, 10 years. And these patents are relatively broad, but they never led to anything. They were never specific to an actual product that could be used by the industry. But what that means is that there's not really space there for patenting in anti-corrosion and protected coatings. So the protection that we have is really know-how, and that goes to really 3 key elements. The first is our data package. It's a heavily data-driven industry, and if a newcomer wanted to come along and say they had the best additive in the market, they would have to undergo multiple years of testing to prove that to an extent where they can make any sales. That's the hard work that we've done, and that's why we're kind of leading in the field. The second one is that we've tested hundreds of sources of graphene and only a small few work. I think our guys have said we got lucky early on that we found one that did work, and we built on that since. But to luck in on that would be, it would be lucky. So if someone wanted to try and develop from the ground up, they're going to have to undergo a lot of hard work, and that's been validated to us by the coatings companies themselves who tried with graphene, particularly 3, 4, 5 years ago when there was a bit of noise around and it didn't work. So that was a barrier that we actually had to overcome to get into these testing programs and trials. And thirdly, dispersion of graphene is not simple and easy. We've got a proprietary method around that as well. And we've had Additive sitting on the shelf for 2 years, which is basically the required time period for a commercial product. And we use proprietary dispersion techniques to do that.
All right, this probably leads into the next one pretty well, actually. Just about the competitive landscape, I guess. Are there competitors in graphene additives, in protective coatings, and even non-graphene ones?
It's a good question. Non-graphene ones for this type of performance impact, no. Within protective coatings, it's not easy to take an existing product which has been used for, in some cases, 15, 20, 30 years and performing very well and boost its performance. That's what we've done, and that's what we've shown through the use of our additive. Within graphene, the competitive landscape, I would only identify a couple of products or technologies. One that's being developed by Petronas called ProShield, which utilises some of their waste product from their oil and gas process, which they convert into graphene and then have developed an additive for coatings that are used on their assets. We've seen that Petronas are utilising that themselves for some of their coatings that are used, but we haven't seen anything more widely in the market beyond their kind of captive share there. And there's also a company in Brazil which is promoting their additive. But again, we haven't come up against that directly. To our knowledge, what we have seen, and we had some results from one of our programs recently where a number of graphene sources were used, and the Eospark came out the best in terms of its performance, which is obviously pleasing.
All right, I think we've got one last one here. Does Sparc expect to enter other coatings categories once protective and marine coatings commence, or will this be a sole coating focus for some time?
That's a really good question. And I'll include water-based in protective coatings because the water-based stuff that we have done is a subset, albeit a small but growing one within protective coatings. The answer to that is yes. We're actually, because of our R&D work in the protective coating space, we've got a lot of knowledge, a real head start on how to utilise graphene into a broader range of coatings. And we're actually looking at other applications at the moment, particularly looking at the level of conductivity of graphene. And there's a coatings category called ESD, which is electrostatic dissipation. Effectively, like on a trampoline where you get a spark, you don't want that happening where you've got, chemicals or semiconductor manufacturing or pharmaceutical plants. So they use these ESD coatings. We're looking at that market quite closely now because graphene is highly, highly conductive. And if we can utilise graphene at the appropriate cost point and deliver the small levels of conductivity that you need for that anti-static characteristic, then you've got a really good opportunity there. And as I said, we've been working on conductivity in coatings for a few years now because it's extended across some of our other work in anti-fouling. So that's a new one that's come up and a good example of, I guess, extensions on what we've built already.
All right, I do have one more, Nick. There are actually a couple of on the hydrogen, but we might just leave those for when we do the hydrogen webinar next. But there is one more here at the end which I think it's not a bad one to end on. When can we expect first dollars in the door?
That's the million-dollar question. Look, we've publicly been consistent in saying that FY26 for commercialisation. I'm very hopeful that it would be, not too far away, whether that's dollars or a commercialisation agreement, which leads to the same thing. That's really how we define commercialisation. So I'd love to say late this year, but let's wait and see.
All right. Thank you again, everyone who joined us today, and thank you, Nick, for the presentation. We'll be watching on with interest as Ecospark continues progressing towards commercialisation. I'll let you wrap up there, Nick, if you'd like, and thanks, everyone.
No, look, just to say thank you everyone for joining, and a recording will be made available.